Number 1. I could never sleep well in hotels. I guess that's somewhat of an understatement. I could never sleep well in general, but hotels were the worst. Just the thought that the previous occupant of this bed is a complete stranger was repulsive in my mind, but that's beside the point. What I'm getting at is how this lack of sleep in hotels changed my life. Christmas. We were spending Christmas in a run-down hotel, and not with family. Great. Don't get me wrong, it's not like I didn't enjoy the all-you-can-eat buffet of soggy hash browns and grits for Christmas Eve dinner. Of course, the first snow of the season had to cancel our flight down to Virginia. It was Christmas Eve, and I was trying to sleep in a bleach-saturated room. My mind wondering what happened in here to cause such an excessive amount of bleach to be needed. The room was nothing out of the ordinary. 2 beds, one for me and my sister, and another for my mum and dad, a bathroom, and a stained microwave that looked in need of a good dusting. Somehow, I escaped the room and the stench of bleach into a dreamless sleep. Waking up, I could tell it was early morning. My sister was next to me, snoring, and she usually wakes up before 4 a.m. That's when it hit me. It's Christmas, and I was about to let this bad fortune ruin my favourite holiday. Looking across the bed at the clock to check the time is when I noticed it, the silhouette of a man about 6'3" across the room, staring at my mum sleeping. Still half asleep and caught up in the moment, I couldn't help but think of Santa Claus. I realised how stupid the thought was, and horror soon filled my head. I choked back a screech. I knew I couldn't let him see me awake, so I quietly put my head back down, pretending to sleep. My mind was racing. Someone was in my room, and I couldn't do anything. I was a scrawny 16-year-old, and this man looked built like an ox. I wondered if I could wake up my dad in time, but I knew that wouldn't work. He slept like a rock. A bucket of water couldn't get him up fast enough. I was practically in tears. I'd never felt so helpless. For a second time, I choked back a scream. He was standing next to me, and I could feel and hear his repulsive breath on my face. It smelled like he'd been eating rotten meat for a week now, with no thought to brush his teeth. If he didn't know I was awake, surely he did now, seeing my face was contorted in fear. The breathing stopped, and I couldn't help the sigh of relief. I would have kicked myself, but there was no need. I heard the room door open and close. I launched out of bed. Nothing in the room was in disarray, and my family was still asleep. That couldn't have been a dream. I couldn't have imagined it. Feeling awake as ever, a horrible idea popped into my head, and before I could push it away, I was pulling the door open. Glancing back to the door in order to memorize the room number, I saw the giant spray-painted black X on the door. Had I seen this without the prior experience, I probably would have thought it was just some stupid kids. But I knew better, but not enough to know what it was. My heart skipped a beat. There he was, turning the corner at the end of the hall. Why am I doing this? I tailed him down to the parking lot. He was nowhere in sight. One moment, he was walking out the lobby. The next, gone. Realizing how cold it is outside in the paper-thin pajamas, I returned to the lobby. No one was around. Strange. I could swear there's usually a night concierge. Adrenaline wearing off, I realized how stupid and rash my actions had been. He could have killed me. I cursed myself back up the stairs. I knew something was wrong when I got to my floor. The door to my room was wide open. I hadn't left it that way, right? I walked inside, and after a quick search of the room, I determined it safe, and my family was still asleep. I locked the door and got back into bed, though I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I listened to my dad get up, and eventually my mum followed, but I still pretended to sleep. A few hours passed, and my parents got my sister and I up. We got into the car and made our way back to the airport. Digging through my bag to grab my iPod led to the finding of something that hadn't been there the previous day. A note that simply held the 5 words I still think about to this day. I knew you were awake. It's now been 2 months since the hotel experience. I'm still scared for my life, and it gets worse every day. That note I found wasn't the only one. I still receive them. Number 2. Patrick Finn arrived home from his Christmas conquests, beating out the snowstorm by mere miles, mere minutes. He felt not only the foreboding presence of a hazardous blizzard, but also that of something else, something darker. It felt as if it resonated not only within his soul, but also within the souls of those around him. Within the very ground itself. Patrick had never bothered to check, but he was sure that beneath the grass and soil of Winter Harbour, Maine, there in hungered, a gaping mouth, or a chasm yearning for the flesh of the innocent, and anchored to the physical world only by a desire to seem normal. It had not yet been appeased, because the residents of Winter Harbour were all but innocent. Patrick had moved to Winter Harbour, hoping to escape the despondency and despair he had felt in his hometown, Belmont, Maine. So far these feelings had only amplified, magnified, by both the wintry death that he felt tiptoeing in the town's midst, and the lingering scent of paint that seemed to permeate every building in the city. It was as if the town was constantly being repainted in some sort of half-hearted attempt to cover something up. Still, he felt it necessary to stay, so as not to make matters worse for his wife, whom he barely saw anymore, and his son, who always seemed so distant. He and his wife were going through a rough time in their marriage, and their son was feeling its effects. It was akin to what one may feel after a tumultuous earthquake. Patrick felt that he had to make it up to his son, so he went out and bought him the most expensive and extravagant thing he could get his hands on this late in the shopping season: a brand new video game system. He had assured his son that even though he had acted out often this year, Santa would bring him something good. Throughout these charades, Patrick felt empty at the prospect of shopping for a boy that he knew nothing about, a boy whose existence was forgotten ever so often. On the eve of Christmas, Patrick arrived home before the snowstorm and quickly crept into the garage to wrap the present and place it under the tree. It was in the garage that he often felt abrupt changes, as if within its small space it contained secrets beyond human comprehension. The musky smell of the old holiday decorations, coupled with the omnipresent scent of fresh paint, varnish and force, and gasoline, all seemed to meld into one personified force, whispering sweet nothings to Patrick as he exited his car. This caused him to shudder heavily, as if beset by a fit of delirium tremens. He shrugged off the dull headache and dry mouth before quickly and sloppily wrapping the gift. Following this, he slipped it under the tree and began to creep upstairs. He couldn't help but grimace at the thought that he was as far from Santa as humanly possible. As he reached the top of the landing, Patrick glanced over at the clock. It read 11:49. He stood there, as if to wait for some fleeting childhood feeling that may accompany the arrival of Christmas. It did not come, as he soon found, nor did cheery music, nor the scent of evergreens and cookies, just deafening silence and that horrid smell of paint. It was everywhere, inescapable. The arrival of yet another disappointing Christmas struck Patrick like a blow to the face. He fell to his knees, then subsequently onto his stomach. He couldn't tell if he had passed out or not. Suddenly, a loud sound in his son's room jarred Patrick awake. He quickly got up and stumbled into the room. The popping sound he had heard made him wonder what had made it, and when he finally found out, he was confused even further. A large black humanoid, adorned with goat horns and a tongue that writhed like a snake, stood before him clutching his son. Patrick stood dumbfounded, seemingly incapable of recognizing not only the creature, but anything else before him. "What do you want?" Patrick asked innately. He knew that the creature wanted something. The creature smiled, licking his lips. "Thine tender fruit, not spoiled by the worms of new, but by the tree that bore it, ripened not unto ambrosia, but a rotten, hollow core." Patrick stared at the creature. Sweat began to collect on his brow. He felt as if his brain had itself been lit afire. He couldn't breathe. I can't say I understand," Patrick stammered out. The creature smiled again. "Not by love of a dying star can a planet be adorned, but by the eruption of its most sacred peaks. I desire the treasures from which you hope to find salvation. The gift to your boy. It is a gift for me now." Patrick couldn't understand why the creature would want the game system, but he felt it necessary to give it up. He quickly bolted down the stairs, grabbing the box and clutching it tight. He sprinted back up to his son's room. The creature, upon his arrival, thrust Patrick's son to the floor and held out one long, beckoning hand. As Patrick handed over the present, he couldn't help but feel as if he were forced himself, exchanging an eternity for one single moment of gratification. The creature licked its lips once more and disappeared in the time it took Patrick to blink. When he was sure he was alone, Patrick fell to his knees and wrapped his arms around his son. He expected a "thank you" or an "I love you," something. He heard nothing. He looked down. He found that his son was withering away, becoming the very shadows that inhabited the night around him. Patrick knew at that moment that he was entirely alone, swallowed finally by the chasm beneath his feet. He stumbled to the garage before sitting down, embracing his solitude and his communion with the musky smell of paint that seemed to beckon invitingly. Number 3. Staring at the tree, whiskey in hand, Pete was pleased that this year would be different from the last. It had been the strangest time of his life, but he truly felt like things were finally coming together. And when better to come together than at Christmas, a time he loved more than any other. In some ways, the past year had been like an eternity. In others, as if it had succumbed to time in the blink of an eye. But either way, he was glad to see the last of it. Staring at the Christmas tree, its beautiful lights casting a warm hue over the window, and the snow quietly falling outside as the sun set, Pete began to think of the past year, of his daughter Lana, and his wife Jeanette. It had started with a very normal December, 12 months earlier. The small town in which they lived was covered in a thick layer of snow, the residents spending most of their days clearing driveways, and Pete's wife going off for one of her usual wanders. She had been gone for a couple of hours, but while Jeanette was utterly devoted to her family, she still needed moments to herself, to clear her head, to diminish the stress that comes with a loving yet disorganized husband, and a little girl who was kind, but who enjoyed trying her parents' patience as much as possible. When the tensions of a domestic life clouded her feelings, or began to weigh on her spirits, Jeanette would wander out of the back door into the fields and woodland, which characterized the entire area, and trek, for a little while, through the pines which dotted the landscape. It therefore wasn't unusual for her to be gone for fairly long periods, especially since it was around that time of year when she would take it upon herself to choose the Christmas tree. No matter how much Pete or Lana asked to help out, this was Jeanette's job. She loved the tradition of it. The process of choosing the best possible tree, cutting it down, and then seeing the bright smiles on her family's faces as they would gleefully take the tree indoors and decorate it with sparkling glitter garlands, warm glowing lights, and an array of festive baubles. It was a small highland town where they lived, far away from any major city, but Jeanette and the rest of her family loved their home. The simplicity of it, the feeling of being an integral part of a close-knit community, and of course, the beautiful surroundings, lush during the Scottish summer, and cold, crisp, stark but yet awe-inspiring in the winter. Most importantly, she loved the pine woods nearby, specifically a collection of trees which sat at the top of a small hill within walking distance from the house, perfect for picking a Christmas tree. She would return there each year, and while their numbers thinned due to a few other neighbours going there for the exact same purpose, there were enough trees to last a good many years. When she had been gone for 3 hours, Pete began to grow nervous, as this was longer than usual, and since it was getting dark, he took it upon himself to venture outside, telling Lana to lock the doors after him, and that he would not be long. Lana laughed when he told her that he expected that Mummy was struggling through the snow with a huge tree, bigger than any other they had ever had. Pete loved to see the excitement in his daughter's face at this time of year, and he told her to watch from her bedroom window to see what they would bring back. With this, she excitedly ran up the stairs straight to her window, before he had to call her back down to lock the door. Gazing at the beautiful tree, he could remember that night like it was yesterday. The snow was crisp on the ground and crunched under his feet as it began to freeze. Small flakes fell from the sky occasionally, but Jeanette's footprints remained uncovered. Even without them, Pete knew where they were heading. The hill where Jeanette returned each year was only a 40-minute hike away. She would pick a pine tree from there. In fact, sometimes she picked two, one around 6 foot, and the other, a young tree about half of the size, if they could find one suitable. It was difficult at times to find smaller trees, as they seemed to be rare in that area. Everyone in town seemed to like the idea of having a small tree in their children's bedrooms, so people would climb up there with an axe and take what they wanted, so there weren't as many at hand. Lana at one time had thought it was sad to cut down and kill the trees just for people to look at, but Pete explained to her about the tradition, and he was sure more would grow back. With time, she forgot this protest and looked forward to the years when she could have one. If a smaller tree couldn't be found, they had a lovely synthetic one which would sit at her window. Secretly, she liked this just as much. But, as her father had said, tradition is tradition. The larger tree would be placed in the living room and adorned with an assortment of baubles, glittering decorations, and lights. The other, in Lana's room, would be sprayed with a can of fake snow and covered in hanging candy sticks and chocolates. Although she was always told she could have only one a day before bed as a treat, of course she would occasionally break this rule and just hope no one would notice. Jeanette could always tell, but she would let it go. Christmas time was the best of times after all, and it was so brief. As Pete approached the hill, he knew something was wrong. He felt it in his bones. As he climbed, the snow began to fall in greater volume, and the sky dimmed with it. Standing at the humble summit, a stillness spread, silence interrupted momentarily by the almost audible patter of snowflakes floating gently to the ground. He followed the footprints now with purpose, knowing that if the snowfall increased, that it would be nearly impossible to find Jeanette. Twilight fell, covering everything in a dark blue wisp of colour as the frost began to nip at his now rosy cheeks. The footprints bobbed and weaved their way through the huge pines, finally stopping next to a wonderfully thick and vibrant tree, one which was perfectly suited for their purposes. The perfect size, almost 7 foot tall, a deep life-filled green, and a thick abundance of branches and pines, which made it almost impossible to visually penetrate its cover in such a light. But yet Jeanette was nowhere to be seen, and as far as Pete could tell, there were no other tracks in the snow leading away in any direction. She had most certainly been here, but where had she gone? This was both puzzling and worrying. It seemed impossible, but there they were, Jeanette's last 2 footprints engraved in the ground, but the snow all around, virgin, undisturbed, and lacking all signs of life. It was as if she had just vanished into the night. Looking at the base of the tree, Pete ran his fingers over a deep gash in its trunk. There was no doubt about it. Jeanette had taken a few swipes at it with her axe. Then, for some unknown reason, she had left, or perhaps moved on to a tree she felt was more suitable. Surely not, though. The tree was perfect. That must have been it, though. She must have moved on. Perhaps there was some random, freakish flurry of snow which covered her tracks. Yes, that must have been it. But Pete knew this was wishful thinking. He had lived there for years, and in all of that time, he had never seen such a thing. Then, he saw it. Several meters away, lying in the snow, was Jeanette's axe. He rushed over to the object, falling once as the snow deepened. Rising to his feet, it was now unmistakable. Yes, it was partially covered in snow, but it was Jeanette's axe all right. It lay there, much like the footprints, isolated, but with the abundance of any human imprints. It was as if the tool had been dropped from a great height, but Pete did not care to speculate. A sense of growing worry permeated his mind as he thought of Jeanette lying somewhere, injured, increasing his anxiety. Shouting his wife's name repeatedly drew no reply, as darkness now began to creep ever closer. If she was hurt, he would have to raise the alarm and get the town out looking for her. Along with the mountain rescue, she wouldn't survive long in the snow, in that biting cold. At this thought, the panic grew. Worry, fear, hurt that can only be felt through love. With torch in hand, he continued in the direction the axe had taken him. As he entered a thick den of pine trees, he noticed the broken branches littered on the ground, as if something had rushed past, tearing them apart and breaking them off on impact. Maybe Jeanette ran through here. The scale of the damage, however, looked too great to have been dealt by one person alone. Had he been in any other country, he would assumed a bear was nearby, but they had been hunted to extinction in Scotland long ago, along with the wolves and any other predators. For a moment, his torch reflected off of something scuttling under a bush, but it looked more like an insect than anything else, and again, far too small to cause such devastation. Pete fixed his scarf, trying to cover his face as the frost bit deeper, but just as he did so, something caught his eye, something on the ground. Shining his torch on what he first thought to be a dead animal, was the crumpled body of Jeanette, laying still on the ground. A heart attack, they said. A heart attack. But Pete had seen her face. He had looked upon those eyes, once filled with kindness, transfixed in a frozen stare. Cold, glassy, black with fear. Her hands were clenched in front of her, and the pathologist told him that this was perfectly normal for one suffering such a massive heart attack in such low temperatures, as was the contorted look on her face. Although, at the mention of this, Pete saw a flicker in the pathologist's eyes, which gave away that he was as puzzled by that look as anyone. A look Pete would never forget. Darling Jeanette, love of his life, mother of his children, dying alone in the cold, with lips pulled back over teeth in agony, frozen into an inhuman sneer. The whole ordeal had devastated him. If it hadn't been for their daughter Lana, for the necessity of her needs to be met before his own, Pete would have found it nearly impossible to have gotten through it. The past 12 months had been cluttered with reminders of an aching loss. As with any bereavement, the first time of doing something once shared with that person made the pain more acute. The first Christmas, the first day at work, the first walk to school, the first family get-together. Every person's face etched in concern, accompanied by the usual well-meaning but empty traditions of, "How are you holding up? It must have been so difficult, and if there's anything I can do." Helping his daughter through the loss of her mother was all he had to make sure he could face another day. But that stopped now. They had been through the horror, through the denial, through the silent meals, through the lonely cries of despair at night, through the birthdays empty and somber. They had been through it all. All these firsts were over. It had been over 12 months since Jeanette's death, and Pete felt almost exhilarated by this. He still missed her, every day. The pain would never truly leave him, but the feeling of accomplishment, of strength, something which he had thought had deserted him, that he had endured, filled him for the first time with thoughts of the future, thoughts that life does indeed go on, even when our dearest have gone before us? And what of his beautiful daughter, dear, kind Lana? He may have felt compelled to bring her through the past year, but her empathy and strength had left him in awe, characteristics which someone so young had no right to possess, but which were thankfully present nonetheless. When she had cried, he had been there, and on more than one occasion, when he lay sobbing, staring at that empty void of space in his double bed at night, Lana would waken and climb in beside him, and they would both cry together until they fell asleep. She was his rock, and by God she was going to have the best Christmas she had ever had. Pete had made a number of arrangements. He had spent a fortune on every gift imaginable. He had filled the house with every food and treat that she enjoyed, and both Jeanette's parents and his own were flying in for Christmas dinner to be with their brave, sweet little granddaughter. He had also organised for Lana's friends to have a sleepover on Boxing Day, which she had pleaded for, but Pete always knew he would give in eventually. She never asked for much, but this year, this Christmas, she would have more than she could imagine. The house was perfect, but there was one thing left to do. One thing that Pete had dreamt of since the night he found Jeanette's body. She had chosen that tree. It was going to be sitting in their living room, adorned with all manner of decorations. That was its purpose, its very reason for being. Jeanette never finished cutting the thing down. It was in many ways her dying act, and Pete was going to make sure that it was fulfilled. On the anniversary of her death, he wandered through the snow, winding his way through the pines, until he stood at the foot of that ominous little hill. The sun shone brightly, and it wasn't as cold as it had been the night Jeanette died. But each footstep was accompanied by a sickening in the pit of Pete's stomach, each stride a morbid reminder of the previous year, and that terrible heartbreak in the snow. Marching to its peak, he first walked to and observed the scene of Jeanette's untimely death. Standing there where her body had laid, Pete wiped the tears from his eyes and placed a small Santa figurine in the ground, burying it in the snow. It had always been hung from the branches of each yearly tree, and was her favourite decoration. It seemed only right that it be with her. After another few minutes of trudging, there it was. It was still standing, that damn tree. As if ravenous for revenge, Pete pulled Jeanette's axe from his backpack and charged at the pine. He battered and chopped the cut which Jeanette had made the previous year, making it deeper with every slice, with every pound of pressure he could muster. The tree groaned and creaked as if in pain, but Pete did not care. This tree was the final reminder of Jeanette's death. Whatever had happened that night, it happened because of that tree. As crazy as it seemed, it all made sense for a moment, and then clarity was clouded by mundane reality. She had simply died of natural causes, with the roar of cracked wood breaking under its own weight. The tree swooned and collapsed to the ground in defeat, tying a rope around its trunk, and then using string to fold its branches inward. Pete dragged that memory, that cold-hearted pillar of nature's brutality, through the snow, over the grass and gravel, and finally to his back door. He was victorious. With little thought for carpet or furniture, he dragged it up the stairs into the house, and placed it in front of the window in the living room, wedging it upright into the old wooden stump they had used as a stand every year. Breathless and covered in sweat, he stood back looking at the tree standing tall over all it surveyed. "You picked a good one, love. You picked a good one." He held back the tears and waited for Lana to return home from her friends. Pete put an old Christmas film on the television as they both decorated the tree together, singing, laughing, and being a family. There were moments fleeting glances when they caught one another's stare, a glance which showed pain buried deep down inside, one which said, "I miss her too." But it was Christmas, and the moments of grief passed, buffered by longer, caring periods of happiness, contentment, caressed smiles from ear to ear, and festive spirit once more filled that home, which had for too long been host to loss and anguish. As the night began to fall, after Lana went to bed earlier than usual, because the excitement had worn her out, Pete decided to reward himself for the day's effort. The lights were dimmed, and after pouring himself a large whiskey, he sat on the living room couch and stared at the tree, draped in tinsel garlands and adorned with bright white Christmas lights. It really was a sight to behold. The best tree they had ever had. "Here's to you, gorgeous," Pete said, lifting his drink to the sky in a symbolic gesture, staring at the Christmas tree, its beautiful lights casting a warm hue over the room, and the snow quietly falling outside as the sun set. Pete began to think of the past year, of his daughter Lana and his wife Jeanette. Time passed slowly as he thought of all the things gone and how they had led to this moment through pain and suffering, but now hopefully onwards to the future, and one filled with at least the briefest possibility of joy. The glow from the tree reflected off of the window, but it penetrated far enough to illuminate the now thick blur of snow, falling to the ground silently outside. The room remained dark, but the lights bathed everything subtly in a warm Yuletide radiance, which when accompanied by the orange lambency of the fire, only served to cultivate the anticipation for Christmas even more so. For the first time in a year, Pete was happy. Something bothered him though. There was a slight apprehension or annoyance at the back of his mind, something which was spoiling the display. Sipping at his whiskey, casting a glance at the entire room, he finally saw what the problem was. Two of the Christmas tree lights were occasionally flickering, not constantly, but often enough to be noticeable, and more importantly, aggravating. Downing the rest of his drink, Pete rose to his feet now, feeling the aches in his muscles from the effort exerted while dragging that thing all the way home from the hill. Walking over to the tree, the lights were indeed flickering, but there was something unusual about them. They seemed deeper than the rest, as if coming from around the trunk rather than resting on the branches. Again, Pete was struck by how dark the interior of the tree was, that even in the presence of many lights placed upon it, he could not peer or adequately see between the branches. Even the two lights which sat deeper behind the pines did not seem to illuminate their surroundings in any way. The empty glass slipped from his fingers, smashing on the floor. The lights were fine. They were not flickering at all, but the occasional blinking of two eyes amongst the branches had been enough to catch his attention. He froze to the spot, and it was as if the room grew somehow darker. Something stirred between the pines, between the knotted wood and the scratched porous surface. Something lived there. A feeling of utter paralysis now took hold, his feet firmly glued to the ground, as the two eyes slowly pushed forward, creaking and cracking. A face revealed itself from between the pine-covered branches, as if seeping out from its innermost visceral point. Mold-covered, ancient, its features twisted in rage. Fear began to course through Pete's veins. His heart beat faster and faster as the face moved closer, its eyes devoid of pupils, now swamped in a maddened yellow, and from below, the protrusion of two thin moss-covered legs arched out from between the branches. With a creak and snap, it straightened itself out, standing in all of its terrible glory in front of the tree. It was now pitch black outside, and it would have been clear to Pete that this animal, this creature, was of a nocturnal nature. But in its stare, he found himself helpless. His heart skipped. First, it was a palpitation. Then, he could feel a searing pain in his left arm. He clutched his chest, but his feet remained adhered to the ground, and it was impossible to look away from those yellow, unmarked eyes. Its gaze came closer still, and in pain, which it brought, Pete knew he was going to die, to be found like Jeanette, cold, face contorted, and the second victim of that which lived amongst the pines on that hill. The pain was now unbearable, but the paralysis removed the possibility of a scream. What little light there was from the fireplace now illuminated its head, elongated on one side, pulsating on the other side. Its face dominated by a large dark hole which appeared in place of a mouth or nose, one which no light could penetrate. As its boil-ridden head stooped to meet his own, and the hole in his face almost touched his mouth, an involuntary sneer pulled Pete's lips up to reveal his teeth as his face contorted into an entirely unnatural position. Then, that one word, a word so powerful, so pure that even the most evil of intentions could be dispelled by it. Daddy. With the snap of wood, the gargoyle-like creature turned its wide yellow gaze to Lana, standing at the bottom of the stairs in her pajamas. Her scream echoed out into the night, arms outstretched. Its odd-numbered fingers moved with a stutter as its moss-covered legs groaned, carrying it forward in a peculiar unbalanced motion towards her. Now Lana was paralyzed by its stare, and with each step closer, her face contorted more fiercely, and the pain in her chest brought her to the point of unconsciousness. As intense as the ancient gaze was, it was focused. So focused that it didn't notice Pete clawing his way across the floor towards the kitchen. The wooden creature's unsure movements made it appear more like a puppet than a thing of autonomous purpose, and as it reached Lana, it cupped her face in its uneven hands and stared wide-eyed and pupilless into her face. Tears streamed down her cheeks. The sound of feet running filled the air, and as it twisted to investigate, a loud crack was heard as Pete ran up onto the couch, jumping high into the air, bringing Jeanette's axe down deep into its spine. No blood ran or gushed, but a plague of unfamiliar, insect-like critters poured out of the wound. Instead of a howl of pain, the creature emitted a crescendo of strange squeals and clicks before throwing Pete to the ground and smashing through the back door. Lana's father gave a chase, but it was impossible, as the wooden creation moved at an unimaginable pace, gliding on the ground with each stride, leaving no footprints in the snow. After a visit to the nearest hospital, both Lana and her father were given a clean bill of health, but they never returned to that house, filled with memories of good times, the happy times of a mother, a wife, a kind soul, of birthdays and weddings, and of course, of Christmas time. Pete didn't know what the creature was, whether it was alive or dead, or something else entirely inconceivable to human mind. But he made a solemn promise to himself from that moment on. Never again would he cut down a tree, decorate it, and take enjoyment in its appearance as it died, because no matter how pretty they are, no matter how much warmth they may give, no matter how much they might make people think of Christmas, you just don't know what might be living inside. Number 4. He first suspected that they were going to eat him when he noticed the distinct lack of Yuletide smells. It wasn't perhaps a conscious thought, at least not one which had been fully realized, but there was a clear growing uneasiness within him. Somehow, he just knew. Surely, if a family invited you for Christmas dinner, the house would be filled with the wonderful aromas associated with that annual feast. Succulent roast turkey, honey-glazed vegetables, perhaps the fumes of mulled wine or a brandy-covered Christmas pudding. But no, all of these were absent. Yet, the table was set. It was a particularly bleak Christmas, and while snow was often welcome at the festive time of the year, the penetrating cold and frost which seemed to sabotage both homes and their residents' bodies was not. The temperature had plummeted on the 7th, and there had been little sign of any forthcoming reprieve. Families attempted as best they could to reach one another, but for many, it was to be a lonely Christmas day. Travel, especially for the elderly, was almost impossible for fear of slipping on the ice. One fall was all it would take for a broken hip or shoulder, and for the more fragile individuals amongst them, recovering from such an injury was not an easy task. Certainly not as easy as it would be for those of a younger vintage. The Cardinal family had taken pity on an elderly gentleman who had recently moved into the neighborhood only a few streets away. They were of an upstanding stock and took part in a local home help initiative, spending time with the old and vulnerable. Everyone knew and loved them. Timmy was the youngest, a boy of only 5 or 6. He was a child whom all looked upon with great adoration, never complaining, never causing trouble, always adorable, and his 10-year-old sister Camilla was equally as admired. They were both a testament to the caring and nurturing parenting skills of Ben and Lucy Cardinal. Each year, as the cold winter drew in, the Cardinal family were admired for their dedication and commitment to those around them, their passion, almost zeal for helping those who were less fortunate. But behind the smiles and the skin-deep facade of that of a loving family lurked a far more sinister purpose. They had a tradition each year, a way to reward themselves for their kindness and generosity, one which stemmed back through many previous generations of the Cardinal family. Each Christmas, they would invite a guest for dinner who would be welcomed with open arms into their home, sat down at a beautifully set table, provided with humorous and enjoyable Christmas conversation, and then, by the light of the roaring fire, the guest would be stabbed to death and eaten gratefully. They all revelled in the old tradition, with Timmy looking forward to it the most. He had a furious appetite and a waistline to match it. But children do get so wrapped up in the anticipation of a family Christmas, and his parents were delighted to see a growing boy fill his belly. Camilla was of a more quiet disposition than her stout little brother, slight of figure, with a pallid complexion, which reminded all of her mother. But make no mistake, she adored eating with the family, and could render anyone silent with a sharp, cold insult. Ben was the local police chief for the area, so covering up their annual feast was quite the cinch, while Lucy was, shall we say, a relation of sorts, and was entirely enthusiastic about maintaining the Christmas tradition. Their guests were invariably those without family, and often of a ripe old age, forgotten by society, left to wither in their isolated little houses. Ben explained to the children yearly that it was almost a kindness to put the victims out of their slowly increasing misery, and besides, when they did eventually die, they would be shoved into a box in the ground or roasted into ashes, What a waste of good meat. This year, Timmy and Camilla were especially excited. It was all their mother could do to calm their nerves. But on that Christmas Eve, it was nearly impossible, for they knew the special treat they were in for that day. The Cardinals were hosting a most special guest. His name was Sergei Moraru. He hailed from Eastern Europe. They had never had foreign meat before, and the very idea of tearing into some delicious, exotic muscle and fat made this year's feast something to really look forward to. They had met Old Man Moraru just a few weeks earlier, when Ben had noticed the unusual name on his home help list. Each year, as Christmas approached, the volunteers at the local church would be given names and addresses of pensioners in the area who had no family and would be left quite alone over the holiday season. At that festive time of the year, and worried that many of the frailer residents might succumb to the biting cold, church committee members would visit each of these lonely individuals and offer a friendly ear, a helping hand, and often some hearty food to the poorest of those on the list. The names would rarely change, but at least one person on that list would sadly pass away that year. Being an upstanding member of the community and a high-ranking police officer in the area, Ben would often inform the church that one of their flock had sadly passed away, and with no friends or family known, he would concoct a lie, which usually involved a long-lost son or daughter appearing to take their sadly departed parents somewhere far away to be buried. That, or he would say that they had simply moved, having a bit of a deal with a local estate agent and a solicitor's firm to throw the proceeds from any property sales their way. The family were not without influence. It was incredible how little people questioned this, but as the Cardinals ensured that each Christmas meal was not an active member in the church or community, people just assumed that Ben knew best. This year, the Cardinals had been hoping to invite Lucy Rindridge around for her Christmas swan song, but unfortunately, she had died during the summer. Ben had investigated, and he suspected that an intruder had been inside the house with her at the time of her death. But it seemed as though the causes were natural. No, the family would have to have someone different for dinner. Then the name appeared on the list: Sergei Moraru. 83, slight emphysema, no family, knows no one in the area as he has only recently moved here. Perfect. Ben found Mr. Moraru to be an absolute delight. While he was obviously very frail, his mind was still sharp, and he regaled Ben with numerous colourful stories about the old country and the adventures he had had while in the full bloom of youth. Of particular interest were his war stories, and Ben was thrilled to know that their main course would be that of an intelligent, well-travelled man. He even looked unlike any of the previous victims. He was quite tall, although slightly hunched with age, and with a long, crooked nose and intense stare. Ben fancied that in his youth, Moraru would have been quite intimidating. His kind smile and obvious fragile frame, however, left Ben in no doubt that the kids would love him. They enjoyed eating those with character and a gentle disposition. He always enjoyed the meat more if it had a keen mind and was out of the ordinary, as the family religion, one which had managed to stay unseen yet influential throughout the centuries, stated that the eating of another human being would transmit some of its strength to those who devoured it. As with many of those who can only look into the past rather than into the future, Sergei Moraru enjoyed the company greatly and was touched when Ben invited him to sit at his family's Christmas table. The old man was extremely frail and required the assistance of both Ben and Camilla to help him in and out of Ben's car, and then into the house. His emphysema was particularly bad that day, as each step was accompanied by the wheezing, fluid-filled sounds of struggling lungs. Each room of the cardinal home was draped in a multicolored selection of rather crass Christmas decorations, with numerous cards adorning every visible table, and mantelpiece showcasing just how popular Ben and his family really were. The table was beautifully laid, with a red cotton cloth resting underneath an elegant cream dining set. The old man found that the rest of Ben's family were just as pleasant and congenial as he was. Timmy and Camilla were kind and very well behaved for their age, helping the frail old man to his chair carefully and then waiting on him, topping up his drink, as their mother and father busied themselves in the kitchen. Finally, Lucy appeared carrying a huge centerpiece plate. It was unusually large, and as she sat it in the middle of the table, empty and devoid of food, Old Man Moraru caught a look on Lucy's face. It was brief, and he immediately attempted to disregard it as a product of his imagination, but it unsettled him greatly. It was as if a private joke had passed between the eyes of Lucy and her children, a flicker of a grin, and not one of kindness or of Christmas spirit, but rather one resembling that of a conspiratorial bully, as if Sergei was the unwitting recipient of some unwholesome prank, waiting to be ridiculed. Just as the uneasiness began to diminish, Ben appeared with a large, jagged carving knife and a long, two-pronged fork, which reminded Sergei more of a butcher's impalement than that required to cut a decent-sized turkey. A turkey which became increasingly conspicuous by its absence. There they sat for over an hour, each member of the cardinal family replenishing the old man's drink with enthusiasm, and showing concern for every and each cough or moment of uncomfortable breathing experienced by their guest. But it was a strange concern. There they sat gleefully, asking Moraru questions, and then listening to the stories and answers which came about his life, where he had lived, how many battles he had fought in. But the interest and concern seemed to be distant somehow. It was only skin deep each time their guest mentioned the old country. Those same conspiracy-laden glances were traded across the table, as if excited not by the content of the stories, but rather by the simple fact that Moraru was a foreigner. The absence of not only food, but that of the mere mention of it was unsettling enough. But what was more perplexing was that Ben repeatedly stole looks towards an antique clock which sat on a mantelpiece above the fire, looks which were poorly hidden and betrayed their purpose. He was counting down the minutes to some event, while the old man had no idea what that event was. The certainty was apparent that it was not connected to anything cooking in the kitchen oven. Moraru knew that there was simply no food being roasted, grilled, or even cooled on a window ledge nearby. Whatever was being planned, it was not going to involve him eating a Christmas meal. It was Camilla who stopped smiling first at his anecdotes and historical observations. She had ceased listening. No longer was she politely laughing at obvious jokes and the endearing sound of an old man repeating himself through forgetfulness. Camilla was simply staring with those pinpoint, cold, dark eyes, as a snake before a strike. Timmy was next to abandon the act, as he began to grin menacingly at Sergei, as his hands gripped a small serrated steak knife intensely. The most alarming thing was that the focus of Timmy's stare was not the old man's face, but his wrinkled neck. With one last glance at the clock, Ben ceased being the jovial, attentive host and began to run his fingers along a huge carving knife in front of him with a mixture of anger and lust upon his face. Sergei had seen many things in his time, but nothing as surprising and strange and unnerving as this. Finally, when the clock began to chime, Lucy relinquished her false endearing shell and exposed the cold-hearted and twisted personality which lay beneath. As the chimes slowly rang throughout the house, one by one echoing and lonely and piercing in their symbolism, each of the cardinals rose up from their chairs, sharp, jagged knives in hand, and waited. The chime rang once, and they uttered an indecipherable phrase in unison. The chime rang twice, and they increased their cult-like chorus in ferocity and volume. The chime rang 3 times, and then they stopped. All were silent, the house devoid of sound, Christmas spirit, and that of hope. The old man's wheezing grew in intensity as the uniquely bizarre sight of the twisted family about to dine dawned upon Sergei. The family then quietly and efficiently walked around the dining table and stood motionless, surrounding their guest. Just as the old man was about to inquire what was to become of him, the clock on the mantelpiece burst into life one final time. The chime was different from the others. It was sharper, somehow fouler, and echoed once and only once throughout the cardinal home. From behind, Lucy slit the old man's throat from ear to ear as Ben thrust his carving knife deep into Sergei's stomach. Both parents then removed their knives and stood back watching with pride as Camilla cut and stabbed repeatedly, while Timmy thrust his steak knife in and out of Muraru's legs, neck, and arms. After a few moments, the frenzy diminished as both children grew tired, and with one last downward thrust, Timmy drove his steak knife so deeply into the old man's hand that it skewered it completely, embedding itself into the table on which the hand rested. The children now ran to their parents' collective embrace. They hugged and rejoiced in what was a fantastic Christmas game, and now could look forward with delight to some succulent, exotic meat. Arms wrapped around one another, they stared at their victim and began to laugh loudly, commenting on the old fool stories of time gone by, the war, and the old country. As they turned to each other once more, the laughter diminished, and they looked into each other's rosy, blood-covered faces and shared a family moment. This had been one of Ben's favourite sacrifices, but the laughter had not completely ceased. One person was still laughing loudly. Confusion turned to abject horror as the bizarre truth revealed itself. It was Mr. Muraru, sitting covered in blood, his head tilted back and the deep cut in his throat wide open. The dinner guest laughed loud and strong, a laugh which was both young and old. His head arched forward as he pulled Timmy's steak knife out of his hand, dropping it on the floor. Camilla screamed as Lucy hid behind Ben. What they thought to be a corpse now stared at them all, as they had stared at it with a singular purpose. Timmy began to pee himself and cry as 2 previously retracted fangs cracked through the old man's upper gum, revealing a serrated and terrifying grin. As he rose to his feet, Lucy fainted, and with both hunch and age now gone, the cardinal's guest loomed tall and dark before them, his eyes piercing, telling tales of countries and decades, and of centuries of existence. Sergei Muraru ate well that Christmas. Number 5. The Christmas tree in the town square stood tall for all to look at in awe. The varying reds and blues and yellows and greens coiled around the towering tree like a colourful snake. Children tightly clutched the hands of their mothers and fathers and grinned with crooked teeth at the masterful display of the holidays. Its light cast onto the empty buildings and lonely streets emptied by the men and women standing around the spectacle. In the wake of the cheerful holiday smiles came another surprise. Snow began to fall from the sky, dressing the streets in a growing blanket of sparkling white, heavier than a flurry, yet not quite a storm. Children stuck their tongues out with flushed cheeks, giggling as a myriad of snowflakes melted on them, and for that moment, in the bitter cold, it seemed as though the world revolved only around that tree that stood tall in front of them. But there was, of course, the one and only family within that small town who had decidedly rejected the invitation to be around others. Alas, the woman who was much more content sitting idly in her chair and waiting for information regarding her husband. She had told her children that he had been working out the last few days, trying her best to cover up the fact that he had in fact gone missing. Now, with 4 days gone by and nothing to show for it, all she could do is stare intently at the static on the television and neglect the wilting Christmas tree. The woman barely grasped the half-empty bottle of vodka in her hand, and when she heard the pitter-patter of soft feet, she instinctively placed it in the shadows beside her. Her gaze fell on the small boy that sprinted into the living room, waving a tiny turquoise blanket back and forth. "Mummy!" His shrill voice cut through the buzz she had acquired from the alcohol. She winced. "There's a man with a badge at the door. He wants to talk to you." Her daze was immediately broken as she sat upright in the chair, staring at him with a furious rage in her eyes. "You opened the door," she scolded. The boy stared at her for a moment before looking down, only to be met with a backhand across the face. He stepped back, grabbing his reddening face with tears brimming in his eyes. She stood up, exhaling sharply. "I told you to tell me first when someone knocks." She sighed in exasperation, stumbling out of the living room and hugging the wall for balance as she moved to the front door and opened it a crack. Deep in the background, she could hear Frosty the Snowman playing in the boys' room. She shooed her child away, opening the door up enough for her face to be seen. A police officer stood in the snow, fingers in the loops of his belt, as he greeted her with a grin. She met his grin with a deep frown. "What are you doing here so late?" Her voice was slurred, causing the officer's expression to waver. "Your husband." His voice was deep, but as soft as his expression. "We've learned a bit more about where he might be." Her expression almost immediately changed. She stepped back, opening the door fully. The officer stepped in, ranking his feet across the welcome carpet first, as a blast of cold burst into the warm home. She closed the door quickly, shuddering from the bitter weather. Further down the lonely streets, there was movement in the dark shadows beside the buildings and broken lampposts. A figure walked through the darkness as if it was their home, the hood on his head further veiling the lithe person's face from view of the naked eye. The being walked slowly, as if savouring the bitter cold that surrounded him, as pitch-black boots left prints in the thin blanket of the snow. The figure began to speak with the voice of a delicate man. It was a whisper, with the softness of an enthralling lullaby. However, there was a clear malevolence within his undertone. The soft noise sung at a slow pace. "It's the most wonderful time of the year." Nobody was around to hear the man's enchanting voice. However, he seemed to enjoy the solitude surrounding him. Under his arm, he cradled a large cardboard box wrapped haphazardly with a variety of different papers. A substance dribbled from the bottom corner of the box and onto the snow, though the hue was unseen in the darkness. With the kids jingle belling and everyone telling you, be of good cheer. The shadowed man suddenly was subject to the dim spectrum of a barely functioning streetlight. Pitch black eyes sparkled against the brightness as his pale and sunken-in face was shown. However, the visual was only granted for a brief moment as he continued his troll. A droplet of crimson red sunk into the blanket of white as he passed by the streetlight. He looked forward to the police cruiser parked in front of the home that he had been traversing through the snow to find. A small grin formed on his features. His soft feet cracked against the snowy sidewalk, with purpose as he tried his best to stay within the darkness, inching closer to the home. Eventually, he stood at the front of the dreary yet moderately lit up building, and at that point, he walked up the 3 concrete stairs continuously singing to himself, "It's the most wonderful time of the year." He placed the box down at the top step, adjusting the large ribbon that had been placed on it. He stood up, his grin growing from ear to ear as the light washed over his face. A large and jagged scar ran from just beside his eye all the way to his lower jawline. He lifted his clenched fist up, rapping it on the door a few times. He waited a moment before turning around, quickly slinking back into the shadows before the door was opened. The woman had taken her place back in the reclining chair. The officer stood awkwardly as he explained the current situation to her, purposefully ignoring the stench of alcohol in her breath and darting his gaze away from her half-closed eyes. She pushed her bottle of vodka back behind the chair as she listened as intently as she could to the man. She nodded slowly. "So you found his car?" The officer solemnly nodded, granting her another faint smile. "Yes, on the outskirts of town, hidden in the trees." He looked away from her fully now and glanced at the Christmas tree that had shed much of its pine needles due to malnourishment. "We don't know why it's there or where he ran off to, but it's a start. They have the canine unit sniffing for any abnormal scent right now." The wife took solace in that knowledge. Her husband possibly being okay was better than the uncertainty she had been facing. As if on cue, the little boy ran out into the living room once again, practically jumping from the balls of his feet. "I heard a knock, Mummy." She sat up with a sigh. "I didn't open the door this time, Mummy. I promise." She pushed past him, walking down the hallway with the police officer behind her. She opened the door only a crack at first, checking to see if anyone was actually there. She saw no person, but a large gift placed at their doorstep, with a raised eyebrow. She opened the door, glancing to the various different wrapping papers used to wrap around the outside of the box. The officer eyed the present closely before his expression changed. Great concern washed over him as he stepped in front of her with a nervous chuckle. Let me open it first. Probably just some pranksters again." He stepped outside and took out his box cutter, getting onto his knees as he drew a deep breath. This wasn't the fault of any teenage pranksters. He had been in the force long enough to know exactly what this was. With great caution, he took the ribbon off and tossed it aside, pressing the blade into the wrapping paper and through the top of the box. He ran the knife across until he was able to open the top with ease. As he opened it, he drew back quickly, covering his mouth as he fought the urge to vomit. The present had been even worse than he had imagined it to be. Curiously, the wife took a look inside, her expression distorted into shock as she let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed across the darkened sky. She hugged the wall as the little boy ran to the noise. "Mummy, what's wrong?" But she didn't respond, simply falling to her knees as she sobbed into her hands. The boy placed a small hand onto her shoulder. "Mummy?" The child moved to take a glance at the contents of the present. However, the officer stood up quickly and covered the boy's eyes, drawing him back as he stared inside of the box in terror. Inside of the box was a severed head, submerged to the chin in its own pool of blood. The man's hair had been matted with the substance, and his eyes were wide, almost alive with terror. His mouth hung open, and his face was riddled with cuts and bruises. A scar ran from just the right of his eye, all the way down across his cheek to his lower jawline. Atop of his head was a Santa hat tainted with droplets of blood. The officer pushed the child back to his mother, who held onto her with a confused expression on his face. The officer barely stood on shaky legs, holding a ripped piece of the wrapping paper and staring at it. It seemed that the legends were in fact true. He stared at the sticker that had been stuck to the wrapping paper, a still image of Santa waving his mitten to the person looking. To the fortunate family, from Sirius Nightshade. I'm here. Hello everyone, happy holidays, and I hope you enjoyed the SHAF-MAS holiday special. If you liked the video, please remember to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. There will be more videos up very soon. And, as always, stay sinister.